we get some more stragglers in. First of all, thanks so much for having me out here. My name's Johanna Wickman. I'm the Vice President of the Fort Caspar Museum Association up in Casper, Wyoming. I've been working in museums for about 15 years, focusing on military and frontier army history. You're probably wondering why someone from Wyoming is here talking about someone from the 11th Kansas. I actually found Preston Plumb about a decade ago when I was doing research for my master's thesis. The 11th Kansas was actually stationed up in present-day Casper for a period of time, and that was kind of my gateway into the 11th Kansas. So today I'm going to talk a little about him and his connection with the 11th Kansas. I'm also going to put a little bit more of a focus on their service on the frontier because I figure that's probably something that doesn't get talked about a lot in Kansas. It might have some more new information for you. And I also kind of want to talk a little bit about his involvement with veterans after the war. So we'll go ahead and get started. So who is this guy? Preston Plumb. Has anyone heard of Preston Plumb? You don't count, though. You've been hearing about him for a while. Anyone else? Okay. So I called my book The Forgotten Senator, which was a good title. He's just someone that's just kind of fallen through the cracks of history. He led an incredible life, incredibly significant life for Kansas, which will be my second program this afternoon. Yeah, it's a little wobbly. It's okay. I did that too, so don't worry. But my program this afternoon is specifically on him. But he was born in Marysville, Ohio in 1837 and learned the printer's trade at Kenyon College at the age of 12. He actually learned the printer's trade by setting the type for Bibles, which you can imagine how small the type must have been for that. But he really enjoyed the newspaper, the printing trade, and so that experience at college is kind of what funnels him into the newspaper business. So at the age of 16, he starts his first newspaper, the Xenia News, in Xenia, Ohio. Now, while that's going on, of course, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 is also happening. And so Plumb is in Ohio, he's got his newspaper, and he's the editor, he's the writer, he's correspondent, he's everything. It's a small staff. And there's a speaker that comes up to Ohio who talks about recent happenings in the Kansas Territory, what's been going on in Lawrence, the sacking of Lawrence. And he really becomes enamored with this whole concept of the free state movement and making sure that Kansas enters the Union as a free state. And so he comes to Kansas and actually starts writing letters back to his paper in Ohio, traveling all over the territory, describing what's going on here, which is a fantastic source of research, of firsthand accounts of everything that's been going on in the area. And after his first trip, he comes back to Ohio, comes back here again in 1856, and this time he's smuggling weapons for the Free State movement. And it just, you know, he's 19 or 18 years old when he's doing that. And he's got 3 wagons full of, he's got a cannon, he's got rifles, he's got Bowie knives, he's got ammunition, and they're smuggling all these weapons down into Lawrence, and then he stays in Lawrence. And this is in the fall of 56. And he attempts to found his own town, which was called Mariposa, which is near present-day Salina. And they basically got froze out over the winter. They couldn't get enough settlers in. It was too difficult to get food supplies, and so they ended up abandoning the settlement. And so he's working at the Herald of Freedom newspaper in Lawrence, Kansas, and then he hears about the Emporia Town Company, which was a company of 4 men. They needed a 5th with a $1,000 buy-in to be one of the founders of Emporia, which $1,000 in 1857 is a lot of money. So his parents back in Ohio actually mortgaged their home and gave him the money so that he could buy into the town company, which he does. So in February of 1857, he's one of the 5 founders of the town of Emporia. He is the only founder of the town of Emporia to actually live there. And one of the conditions of him being accepted and founding the town was that he needed to start a newspaper. So he starts the Kansas News in Emporia in 1857. Then in 1859, early 1860, he becomes a lawyer. He goes to law school in Ohio for a short period, comes back to Emporia. It now has a law firm, and then he's elected to the state legislature in 1861. And he also becomes a state Supreme Court reporter. And this is all between 1860 and 1862. So he's 24 years old, and he's done all of this. So in April of 61, the Civil War begins. And as soon as the Civil War begins, he wants to enlist. But the people of Emporia convince him not to, because at that time, they're deciding the county boundaries and county seats in the state legislature. And the people of Emporia want Emporia to be the county seat. So he stays in the state legislature. Once that's decided, in the fall of 1862, he resigns from the state Supreme Court reporter and resigns from the state legislature and enlists in the Army. And so he enlists as a recruiting lieutenant for the 11th Kansas Infantry. He recruits companies C and E. Companies are made up of 100 men, and he recruits so many, he fills up company C with an overflow into company E. The 11th Kansas, as it was formed later in the war, a lot of the members are either much older with children or much younger. They were too young to enlist when the first rounds went through. There are a lot of members of the 11th Kansas who are uncles and nephews, groups of brothers, a lot of families, families with businesses, farms, those kinds of things. One thing I want to point out in this picture too, this was taken in either August or September when they first enlisted. You'll notice he is not in a military uniform, but in his hand there he's holding an infantry kepi. So we know this was taken really right when he first enlisted. He was very popular within the regiment. He was promoted to captain of Company C almost right away, and then almost 2 weeks or so after that, he's elected major of the regiment. So the men actually elected him major, as opposed to an officer deciding that. Oh, it got dark. This is probably a little bit hard to read, but I wanted to show this to you because this is actually going to be important later on. This is actually his first enlistment, just this handwritten paper. But you can see on the third line, it says, "I certify that I have this day mustered in the service of the United States for 3 years or the war, Preston B. Plumb as recruiting officer." This is a big deal for the men of the 11th Kansas. Some of them signed 3 years or duration of the war enlistments, not a flat 3-year enlistment. And this will play an important role in the regiment as we get closer to 1865. One of the things that the 11th Kansas are unique to the 11th Kansas, most regiments did not have their own newspaper. The 11th Kansas did for one issue. They briefly had a newspaper. Just prior to the Battle of Prairie Grove, which was on December 7th, 1862, they actually started to publish their own newspaper. It was called the Buck and Ball, and the Buck and Ball name came from the type of weapons that they were issued. Initially, the 11th Kansas were issued Prussian muskets, so these were antiquated even by Civil War times. Think, War of 1812 vintage. So these are 50-year-old muskets. They're heavy, they're awkward, they're bigger. They fire a musket ball and then 3 rounds of buckshot, hence the Buck and Ball name for the newspaper. And the newspaper was actually printed on a printing press that members of the 11th Kansas found in Cane Hill. It had been destroyed and was in pieces by the Confederate Army. They put it back together, got it going, came up with an issue of the Buck and Ball and started printing the first half. The newspaper was a single sheet, double-sided, and so you'll notice this is dated December 6th. They started printing them December 6th, the first half. And if you look too, you can see, it might be kind of hard to see, but let me point one out. You'll notice this T on Tabor is italicized. when they put the printing press back together, they were missing a lot of the type. It had been scattered all over, they couldn't find it. And so reading this is almost kind of like, you know, those ransom notes with the cutout letters, and they look a little bit different. That's kind of what the newspaper looks like. It's not that they didn't know any better, it's that they didn't have the type. So sometimes you'll see an italicized letter, sometimes you'll see a number 0 that should be an O, you know, things like that. They start printing the newspaper, and then all of a sudden, the Battle of Prairie Grove breaks out. And so Preston Plumb takes the newspaper, rolls all up, all the ones that they've printed, throws them in the back of an ambulance, and they have to leave the printing press and go fight the Battle of Prairie Grove. This was one of their first engagements. This was a typical, what we would think of, Civil War battle, Confederate Army marching to meet the Union Army. This for the 11th Kansas is kind of unusual. They do fight some battles like this, but typically what they're fighting is more guerrilla warfare. There are some great stories about the Battle of Prairie Grove, and again, it's so small. The 11th Kansas is right here, next to Rabb's artillery battery. And it's a little dark, but I've got in here, I should have dug this out ahead of time. I think I can still see well enough. There's some great stories about Prairie Grove. When I put this book together, I wanted to include a lot of first-hand accounts wherever I could. And so Corporal Stephen Fairfield of the 11th Kansas later recalled the Battle of Prairie Grove. He said, in the Battle of Prairie Grove, the 11th Kansas got on the field after Rabb's battery had been in action for some time. And that's what I just pointed. Rabb's battery, again, is right here, and there's the 11th Kansas. The battery had been repeatedly charged, and as the 11th passed it, the men saw the horses lying dead about it. Plumb had one wing of the regiment and General Ewing the other. Plumb charged into the timber in front of the battery and drove out some rebels, then supported the battery. General Ewing became engaged with the rebels in the woods to the right of the battery and was engaged there until after dark. After having cleared the field in his front, he led his men back to the line to camp. As he emerged from the woods, the men of the battery supposed it was the rebel force breaking out there to charge the Union lines. The artillerymen were preparing to fire, but were restrained by Plumb, who knew that Ewing was in that quarter. Just as the gunners were about to fire, Plumb became convinced that it was Ewing's men advancing in the gloom, and as the lanyards were lifted for the cannon, he cried, "Hold, hold, those are our men, for God's sake do not fire." In a moment, General Ewing appeared at the head of his men. If the artillery had been fired, a frightful slaughter would have resulted. So in just that one instance, Plumb actually saves the life of Ewing, which is a huge achievement, but also gives you an idea of the confusion of battle and how it's difficult to identify who is friendly, who's foe, and who is who on the battlefield. So after the battle ends, December 7th, they have to take care of the wounded, they have to bury the dead, and that takes up a few days. Plumb actually recovers his newspapers that he had started printing the day before. And they go back to the printing press, which has been destroyed again, rebuild it again, and then write up exactly what happened during the Battle of Prairie Grove, and then print that on the back side. So that's why there's a discrepancy on the Buck and Ball newspaper. It's dated December 6th, but has the stories of events from December 7th. And it's a fantastic resource for that kind of history. This is their first main fight, and of course it's in December of 62, and then we go into 63. And at this time, the 11th Kansas is converted to cavalry. And this process takes about 2 or 3 months. And with many things with the government, it does not go smoothly. No surprise. So what happens is some of the companies are issued horses, but not issued carbines. Cavalry soldiers have carbines because they're much shorter, they're easier to maneuver on horseback and to load and fire and that sort of thing. So you have some companies that have horses but no carbines, and some companies that have carbines but no horses. And so it takes a couple months before the whole process is completed. Once that's done, they end up spending a lot of their time in Kansas, Missouri, and Arkansas doing what we would call guerrilla warfare. So the 11th Kansas is working with other regiments in the area, and they're broken into smaller groups. So groups of 20 to 25 men. They might be made up of some 11th Kansas men, maybe some Iowa men, maybe some Missouri militia, Kansas militia, and they're patrolling different pockets of those areas where there has been known to be bushwhacker, pro-slavery activities. This is a very different kind of warfare than Prairie Grove, where we're talking about the Confederate Army and the Union Army marching out to meet each other. Dealing with bushwhackers, they don't take prisoners, so the 11th Kansas does not take prisoners of them. Sometimes these bushwhackers will be dressed in Union uniforms, so they'll look like friendlies, and then it turns out they're not. They're in civilian clothing typically, so there's someone that they could pass on the road. Oh, I'm just a farmer, don't mind me, but they're not. And it's a very, very brutal type of fighting, which is, it's very unique, and it's a very haunting type of thing. There's one diary entry, Sherman Bodwell of the 11th Kansas wrote, which kind of gives you an idea of what that was like. This was in October of '63, and it says, marched early and halted for breakfast. Major Plumb took his companies B and H and moving toward Napoleon. At about 10, the major and lieutenant and the advance came suddenly on 2 guerrillas mounted. One dismounted and took the brush, but Major Plumb brought him down with his holster pistol. I rode up to the lieutenant, stood over him, his pockets having been searched and papers taken. Among them a discharge from the rebel service signed by the captain, General Rains, and General Price. He was talking, claiming to be a prisoner, etc. The lieutenant asked Major Plumb, "Are you through with them?" Major Plumb nodded assent. Lieutenant said to 2 men standing about, "Mount your horses," and as they drew off, he aimed and fired the revolver ball, striking just back of the eye, and he was with his judge with all his imperfections on his head. The lieutenant stood between us, so I did not see his face. Sergeant Amos Custard, also of the 11th, says he instinctively raised his hand to shield himself, and, quote, an ashy paleness overspread his face as when a cloud passes over the sun. This was routine. This was, you'd find someone, you'd interrogate them, you'd get the information you could, you would execute them, and you'd move on. And they would do the same thing to federal troops as well. So it was a very, very brutal type of combat. The other big event of 1863 is Quantrill's raid on Lawrence. Again, more guerrillas, bushwhackers. Quantrill has about 450 guerrillas. They attack the town of Lawrence and murder approximately 150 men and boys, loot businesses, burn homes, that sort of thing. At that time, General Ewing had gone home to visit his wife, and so Plumb was in command of the district. And so the pursuit of Quantrill fell on Plumb, and this was kind of an event that basically followed him throughout his career, because, as some of you may know, he was not able to catch Quantrill. And the reason for that is because after this attack happens, Plumb is immediately notified by runners who tell him, you know, Quantrill has attacked the town of Lawrence, he's got an army with him, and they've gone this way. So Plumb gathers the 11th Kansas and takes off that way. He's sending dispatches back to Ewing saying what he's doing, notifying the direction they're going, hoping that Ewing will meet him at some point along this pursuit. Well, then he comes across a farmer, another runner. No, he went that way. So Plumb goes back that way, and so on. And this continues for about 24 hours straight, back and forth, different directions. And the whole time he's sending dispatches back to Ewing. Well, Ewing never meets him anywhere. And the men are getting exhausted, the horses are getting exhausted, it's August heat, horses are collapsing, there's no breaks for food or water, and so at the end of it, Quantrill ends up escaping. And so a lot of the townspeople of Lawrence blamed Plumb for that. Although the other problem with that is that Plumb only had about 100 men with him, and if they caught up with Quantrill, they probably would not have been very effective in stopping him either. But that was a major event that really impacted Plumb's military career. And especially his promotion to lieutenant colonel in April of '64, there was some pushback from people within the government, the state government of Kansas, because of Quantrill's raid when that promotion came through. But in April, he is promoted to lieutenant colonel. In 1864, again, they spent a lot of time doing that same kind of bushwhacker fighting that I was talking about before. One of the big things, though, that happens in 1864 is the Battle of Westport. So the 11th Kansas plays a key role in this battle, which I think most people maybe aren't aware of. This was something that I found while doing my research that specifically puts Plumb in a certain spot, which prior to that we didn't know exactly where Plumb was within that battle. But there's actually this really great story, if I can find it. Where is it? There it is. About the Battle of Westport. So where Westport occurred in Kansas City is now basically all developed. You can't get to where this was, where, you know, it's all under roads, that kind of thing. But the Confederate Army is behind a stone wall on the top of a hill, and the Union Army, where Plumb is with the 11th Kansas, is in the bottom of a ravine. And he basically leads a dismounted cavalry charge up a hill. Militarily, this is not something that you want to do. You want to have the high ground. You want to be behind the stone wall. You want to make the other person come up the hill unarmed or without that kind of protection. And that's exactly what the 11th Kansas had to do. And where they were fighting the Confederate Army was such that if this attack failed, the Confederate Army could sweep around and go right into Kansas. So this was also incredibly significant that they stopped the advance of the Confederate Army. It says, this is from Private Walter Wellhouse. He was Company A of the 11th Kansas and was at the Battle of Westport. And he said, to check this advance was now the work of the 11th Kansas. If it should fail, the gravest consequences would follow. The Confederates marched steadily northwest until they came in view of the line of the 11th Kansas. At that instant, Lieutenant Colonel Plumb, with 4 companies of the 11th, was beginning his advance toward the rebels. Seeing this, the Confederates stopped short and formed a line of battle facing Plumb. Plumb marched his men across the state line to a little valley running parallel with the rebel line, and there turned up the valley, and when his troops were directly opposite the enemy, he halted them, faced them about, formed his line, and marched them up the hill, his line firing at will after the first volley. Walter Wellhouse says he never saw a finer sight. The flashes of Plumb's guns were like fireflies in a damp summer night. The advance was irresistible, and Jackman's brigade was swept from the field and rolled back with such loss that no further attempt was made in that quarter by the enemy. This was a very key event that happened for the 11th Kansas in stopping the Confederate advance into Kansas, and was incredibly successful. Also at this time, in October and late 1864, the regiment gains 10 African American undercooks. This is a new piece of information courtesy Rob, who was able to provide me with one of the descriptive role books for the 11th Kansas. And I always like to tell people, you know, you can study something and it's easy for people to think, oh, we've learned everything there is to know. We know it all now. It's done. There's nothing more to add. There is always something more to add. This descriptive role book had a list, of course, of all of the men in the company, and then it gives you their height, their hair color, that kind of thing. Well, it mentions undercooks, and then it says of African descent, and it's spelled out. If you go online on a lot of the rosters, or you look at them in other places, they'll say for the description of AD. And people had interpreted that as, I guess, companies A and D. They had not made the connection that it was of African descent. And this is a big deal because these undercooks for the 11th Kansas were actually issued weapons and fought. They were not just cooks. One of them was actually wounded in battle in 1865. We'll talk about that in a bit, but this is very significant. They were essentially integrated within the regiment, which we wouldn't know if it wasn't for that descriptive role book. So you never know what you'll find. So 1865 rolls around, and the Civil War ends April 15th, 1865, so they should go home, right? No. This is where those enlistments come back. And cause a problem for a lot of the men. Some of them did sign 3-year enlistments, and some of them signed those 3 years or duration of the war enlistments, like Plumb did. The government did not distinguish any of those at all. They treated them as if they had all signed 3-year enlistments, and they were sent west. They were sent west to protect the telegraph route, and it's awful small, but this is Fort Laramie, Wyoming here, and it's too small to read, but each one of these notes that you see here, those are all telegraph stations. They're about every 20-30 miles along the route there would be a telegraph station, and they're sent primarily to Plattbridge Station, which is Fort Casper now, in Casper, Wyoming. And they arrived there in April of 1865. They actually start the process in February of 1865 of getting there. They're hiking through, and a lot of them are walking because they don't have horses, because they lost their horses earlier with everything that was going on in 1864. There were a lot of bad rations, the horses were sick, they were waiting for replacement horses, which a lot of them picked up actually at Fort Laramie. But as they're heading west, many of them are walking through blizzards. There's one story where Plumb issued a bugle call, and the bugler tried to use his bugle, but it was frozen shut. This was not a fun trip. But they make it out west to Wyoming. They're headquartered at Plattbridge Station in that vicinity, and then they're disseminated along the telegraph route in groups of 5 to 10 men at these different telegraph stations. Their regimental headquarters is actually Camp Dodge. This is another thing where I talk about, oh, we know it all, there's nothing else to learn. No. This was a location that we did not know up until just a couple of years ago. We knew that he had established Camp Dodge somewhere at the base of Casper Mountain in Casper, Wyoming. We did not know where, we did not know why, we didn't know exactly what it looked like. There were stories that it was hundreds of men there. There were stories that it was a lumber camp of about a dozen men. No one knew. We got very, very fortunate in that we were sent a donation at our Fort Casper Museum of a descendant of the 11th Kansas, who gave us a portrait, a letter, and some photocopied pages. And on one of those photocopied pages was this map. So this is a map of Camp Dodge, and again, I know it's kind of difficult to see, but this here along the top, this is Casper Mountain, and from Casper Mountain there's a creek that comes down this way and a creek that comes down this way. And again, it's difficult to see, but where the companies are labeled. This is headquarters here, and you can see these triangles, and then you can see these that look like a building. There's another one there, another one there, and the triangles. And so not only did we get a map, we got a good map. So the map tells us that there were 3 buildings there, and there were tents, so we know it was a permanent encampment. It was not just a tent camp. And also what's really unique about this, and you can see from where those triangles are and those buildings are, is that the Camp Dodge is in a V formation. This is unusual. All of the telegraph stations, posts in Wyoming and the frontier there are all basically little squares, you know, just a dot, essentially. And this being a V shape is very unique. This was Plumb's idea. He's the one who laid out this camp. He's the one that designed it. And having been there and walked the terrain, it's actually pretty ingenious because depending on which side you are on, you can see from that spot all of the terrain around you. So if there's a Native American attack coming from the east or the west, you can see that plain as day, which is fantastic because if you're actually at Fort Casper at Plattbridge Station, you can't see what's coming. You're at a very low elevation, it's a bridge crossing, and you can't tell who's coming. And so by putting the 11th Kansas up in the hills at the base of the mountain and then spreading them out in a V formation, he's able to see who's coming and give the fort advance warning before any of those potential attacks come to the area. And here's kind of another close-up of that map. So I'm not stand in front of it. So here's Fort Laramie. This is Platte Bridge Station right here, and Camp Dodge would be right about here, so just a little bit to the south. And each one of these, again, is a telegraph station. Now, while the 11th Kansas is out there, they're not the only regiment there. The 11th Ohio Volunteer Cavalry is also stationed out there. They've actually been out there since 1862. And so they're now working with the 11th Kansas. When the 11th Kansas is sent to Dakota Territory, they are actually given purview over this whole district. The 11th Kansas is in command. And so Plumb, while stationed at Camp Dodge, is actually sending 11th Kansas men to go to telegraph stations with 11th Ohio men. Or so it might be an 11th Kansas officer with 11th Ohio men. Or it could be an 11th Kansas officer with 11th Ohio men. So the regiments are actually kind of intermixed, much as they were when they were fighting the bushwhackers back east. So there's kind of a similar command structure to what they were doing before. On June 3rd, they have one of their first large fights with the Native Americans. This results in the death of one of the 11th Kansas men, Private William Bodwell. That's his picture there. And he's also the one who had the map drawn that we ended up receiving. So just kind of a neat connection there. But what happened is a group of Native Americans came up and attacked the post, Fort Casper, basically fired some, lack of a better term, pot shots at it. This was very common. They would come up and fire pot shots and attempt to lure the army out, and then they would take them into a running fight. And so what happened is the 11th Kansas is now in a running fight with a group of Sioux Native Americans. And so this fight lasts miles. This whole pursuit lasts 7 to 10 miles, exchanging shots. Well, what happens is the Native Americans slow way down, the 11th Kansas catches up, and then Plumb recognizes they're basically being drawn into an ambush. And so he immediately orders a retreat, which most of the men follow, except for Private Bonwell of the 11th Kansas and Private Stallnecker of the 11th Ohio. They were too far ahead. It's unclear whether or not they ignored the order or perhaps didn't hear it because they were so far out front. But then what happened is they were caught up in the ambush, their horses were shot out from under them, and they were killed. And when Plumb sent a record of this fight back to Fort Laramie and back to his commanding officers, he mentioned that now the men know what it's like to fight Native Americans, and they will do better, they'll be more experienced. This was their first taste of that kind of combat, which again is kind of similar to what they were doing with the bushwhackers, but still a little bit different, because with the Native Americans it was that kind of shoot and run and then lead you into an ambush. This actually culminates almost 2 months later with the Battle of Platte Bridge. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. July 26, 1865. For us in Wyoming, especially in Casper, this is a huge fight. You'll notice it involves Lieutenant Casper Collins of the 11th Ohio. This is where the town of Casper, Wyoming, gets its name, is from this battle. And Major Anderson of the 11th Kansas is in command of the fort, and he has 119 men. And on their way to the fort is Sergeant Amos Custard. He was the one I just read a quote from when they were fighting the bushwhackers. He'd been out delivering supplies to some of the other telegraph stations, specifically Sweetwater Station was on his way back with empty wagons. And there were rumors that there were Native Americans in the area who were going to be mounting a large attack. And so Lieutenant Brettney of the 11th Ohio goes to Major Anderson of the 11th Kansas and says, "You've got to send a detachment of men out, bring Sergeant Custard's wagon train in. They're in open ground. It's a dangerous place to be. You've got to get them back to the fort." Well, he ends up arguing with Major Anderson for some time, because Lieutenant Brettney basically wants to take the entire garrison of the fort out there to go get Sergeant Custer, which Major Anderson cannot allow him to do, because his first duty is to protect the fort and the telegraph routes. What he does do is send Casper Collins with 20 men of the 11th Kansas out to go find Sergeant Custard's wagon train and bring him back. Well, as soon as Casper Collins gets across the bridge, which you can see just right here, Casper Collins gets across the bridge and starts to head this way when they get ambushed by Native Americans. Now, the exact number is up for debate. The low end is 500, the high end is 3,000. This was the first time multiple tribes of Native Americans in the area had worked together and launched a coordinated attack. That had never been done before, and it will never be done again. This was a one-off attack, but it was the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho that launched this attack. And so Casper Collins' detachment of the 11th Kansas is immediately attacked. It's mostly hand-to-hand combat because the soldiers are so intermixed with the Native Americans. They're not firing on each other for fear of shooting a friendly fire. And so it's hand-to-hand combat. Of the 21 men, including Casper Collins, that went out, 5 were killed and 9 were wounded. During this fight, Private Harvey Johnson, who was an undercook, who I had mentioned before, the undercooks were issued weapons, was actually wounded in the Battle of Platte Bridge. And the only way he could have been wounded would have been if he had gone out across that bridge to help cover their retreat back. So again, a neat piece of history that we know that they were fighting and doing more than cooking. So that's the Battle of Platte Bridge. This happens in the early morning of July 26th. The same day, we have the Battle of Red Buttes. So here's Sergeant Amos Custer, the 11th Kansas. He has his 3 supply wagons. He's trying to come back to the fort. He's the one that, of course, Casper Collins and the 11th Kansas just went out to try to retrieve. He gets immediately surrounded by Native Americans, and again, it's the same thing. We don't know whether it was 500 or 3,000 or somewhere in between. More than likely, it would have been around 2,000. They have plenty of ammunition, and actually this fight lasts for about 4 hours, if you can imagine that. So they circle the wagons. They're surrounded by Native Americans. They're firing at them. The Native Americans are shooting at them, and the fighting continues until the wagon train runs out of ammunition. And all of this happens only a few miles from the fort. So the men at the fort, the other men of the 11th Kansas, who have been serving with these men for years, since day one, are now watching all of this happen. They're standing on the roofs of the fort building, watching their friends under attack, knowing that there's absolutely nothing they can do to help them. It'd be like watching someone you know being trapped in a burning building. You want to help, but you can't. There's not enough of you to go out there. Of the 25 men in the detachment, 22 of them are killed. There were 3 that escaped, went down into a ravine, and then followed the creek and crawled all the way back to the fort and survived. Of the men that were killed, they were horrifically mutilated and dismembered. This was something that the Native Americans did because of a belief that if someone was physically dismembered, they would be no threat to them in the afterlife. And so this is something that was very common in the fighting in Wyoming. This was completely new for the 11th Kansas. They were horrified when they came across the remains of their comrades to bury them, and really impacted how they viewed Native Americans and fighting in the future. It was just a different type of warfare. And especially for a lot of the men, at the same time, Plumb is writing letters to the governor of Kansas. He's writing letters to generals, trying to get the 11th Kansas discharged, because in his mind, they should be. All of these Civil War regiments have been mustered out. Why is the 11th Kansas in Wyoming? This is not what they signed up for. They should have been discharged. Well, of course they weren't. So this battle happens July 26th. By August 13th, they get their orders that they can now be mustered out. And so they start the process of heading back to Leavenworth to be mustered out. Plumb was promoted to the rank of full-blown colonel in July. He never mustered in at that rank. There were not enough men in the regiment to have a colonel. During the Battle of Platte Bridge, Plumb was not there. That's why I didn't mention him during that fighting. He was actually a little further south at Fort Halleck. He took some of the companies, the 11th Kansas, with him to Fort Halleck. While they were there, they were in charge of protecting the entire overland mail route, which was a huge deal, ensuring that mail makes it from one end of the country to the other. And while Plumb was in command of the overland mail route, there were 0 attacked mail tripped or wagon trains, any kinds of issues with lost mail, late deliveries, those kinds of things. He had no issues overseeing the overland mail route. When they finally get back to Kansas, it's September 29th, 1865, and the reason that takes them so long is that most of them don't have horses. They had to turn their horses in and walk. So, as if, kind of insult to injury after everything. Home from the wars forever, that was actually the last diary entry that Plumb made after they were discharged. And, given his history with the Free State movement, smuggling weapons into Kansas, and what he had been doing then, you can really understand why, especially home from the wars forever. He had been fighting essentially since 1856. Almost 10 years. And a lot of the other men in the 11th Kansas who were also involved in the Free State movement, Major Anderson was one of them, had been fighting this for much longer than the Civil War. So after the war, Plumb returns to civilian life. He's reelected to the state legislature in 1867 and is also Speaker of the House, and he gets married that year. So 1867 was a big year for him. He establishes the Ruggles and Plumb law firm, which is one of the most successful law firms in the state of Kansas. He travels all over the state of Kansas as an attorney and is incredibly successful. And then he also becomes president of the Emporia National Bank during that time. In 1877, he's elected to the United States Senate and quickly becomes a champion of legislation for veterans. The military was always something that was very close to his heart. He always did whatever he could to help fellow veterans, fellow members of the 11th Kansas. There's a great story of Elijah Moore. He was a member of the 11th Kansas who had taken out loans from the Emporia National Bank, the bank that Preston Plumb was president of for a time and was still involved in business-wise when he was in the Senate. And when Elijah Moore took out the loans against this cattle, he had kind of maybe on purpose, overly inflated the value of his cattle to take out the loans. Well, the bank came calling and wanted their money because he had defaulted on his loans. And so they found out that he had overinflated his cattle value, and so they sued him. Well, he sent a letter to now Senator Plumb asking for help. Plumb actually came to his defense, and so when this trial unfolded of the bank against Elijah Moore, Plumb's own bank, Plumb took the side of Elijah Moore, and so he was actually acquitted. So even though he knew Moore was in the wrong, he wanted to support one of his fellow 11th Kansas veterans. Also, when he was running for the Senate, Major Anderson organized a reunion, essentially, of 11th Kansas soldiers to meet Plumb at the train station in Topeka. And so Plumb got off the train in Topeka and kind of put his head down and, was on a mission, walking quickly where he needed to go. And then out of the corner of his eye, he kind of caught these blue trousers, Union blue. And he looked up and there was his old regiment. And he just broke down in tears. Hundreds of them showed up. He was so well liked. But while he's in the Senate, he puts through more pension and disability requests than any other senator. Tremendous help for veterans. And this was for any veteran in Kansas, not just the 11th Kansas, any regiment. Veterans who served obviously in other state regiments. He was very involved with the GAR. If you're not familiar, the GAR is the Grand Army of the Republic. Think of it kind of like a VFW or American Legion for Union veterans of the Civil War. So he was very involved in those posts and also organizing the state encampments in Kansas. Plumb stays in the Senate until 1891 when he dies suddenly of a stroke. He was only 54 years old, so he died very young. He essentially worked himself to death. He was known for skipping meals for days at a time, sometimes not sleeping. He was just so prolifically active in the Senate. At the time of his death, he had submitted over 6,000 pension requests. To put that in perspective, he spent about 14 years in the Senate. Most senators would put in about 30 per session. And for him to do 6,000, he's doing about 500 per session. So he's obviously doing a lot more to help veterans. The GAR post of Emporia, Kansas was renamed the Preston B. Plumb post in his honor. And here's a picture of the funeral in Emporia. Now, when Plumb passed away, he died in Washington, where his body laid in state. The president, the vice president, many came to see him lay in state, pay their respects there. Then the body was sent to Topeka, Kansas, and there was a funeral procession in Topeka, which was attended by 15,000 mourners. Which gives you an idea of how tremendously popular, well-liked he was within the state of Kansas. When the body was brought to Emporia, it laid in state at the family home overnight, where it was under guard by members of the 11th Kansas, and then it was escorted to the cemetery by members of the 11th Kansas, who are pictured here. Unfortunately, I don't know who they are, but I know that those are 11th Kansas men. And another 3,000 mourners showed up in Emporia. So all in all, about 18,000 men came to see him, which was a big deal at the time. His last Senate election was in 1889, and he's the only United States senator from Kansas to be unanimously reelected. He was the first and the only. At that time, senators were elected by the state legislature, and as a Republican senator, the Republicans voted for him. Those of the other parties, the Populists, Democrats, either voted for him or they were not present at the state legislature that day to cast a dissenting vote. So that's an incredible achievement, but again shows you how well liked he was. So after he dies, maybe. Oh, we jumped ahead. There we go. His wife Carrie continues what he was doing. She stays very involved with the GAR post and 11th Kansas reunions. The 11th Kansas would hold reunions at Prairie Grove every year. They would also host reunions in different towns, Emporia, one of them. There would also be other regiments that would host reunions in Emporia, Kansas. What's interesting is the 79th Ohio Volunteer Infantry actually held a reunion in Emporia, Kansas in 1893, and she handed out portraits of Preston to everyone that came, which I thought was interesting. But she was known for buying books, supporting the 11th Kansas veterans however she could. She would help them pay bills if they were struggling, those kinds of things. So much so that she was actually named Mother of the Regiment in 1893. And really it just kind of goes to show how involved not only her husband was, but she was with veterans, with the regiment long after the war. This is kind of my last picture. One of the things that I always like to point out whenever I give this program or I talk about the 11th Kansas is when we work in museums or we work as historians, we tend to talk about these regiments from the period of the regiment was formed, the regiment ended, and that's it. And lots of times what people don't realize or don't often discuss is that these are men who knew each other before the war started and knew each other after the war. So before the war, Plumb knew, and many of the men he obviously recruited, they were from the Emporia area. He'd gone into business with some of them. He was a Supreme Court reporter for the state of Kansas under Thomas Ewing, who was a judge. So he knew Ewing. He knew Major Anderson, Major Martin Anderson, from before the war, from his work in the Free State movement. After the war, many of these men still stayed in touch. Some of them opened up businesses together, members of the 11th Kansas. Some of them intermarried. Their daughter married someone's son, or that kind of thing. And then they would get together for these reunions. When Plumb was elected to the Senate, I've read countless letters from fellow 11th Kansas soldiers, congratulations on your election. I remember when we did this and this, and they kept in touch. And so it's important, you know, when you're talking about one of these Civil War regiments, to realize that these friendships, the camaraderie, the connections that they make during the war stayed with them far beyond when their service ended, just like it is with veterans today. That has not changed at all. Does anyone have any questions? I threw a lot of information at you.
Oh, well, at Emporia, at the college there's Plumb Hall.
Mm-hmm. That's him. Yep.
Yeah.
That money is made possible from his wife, Carrie. She paid for that. Yeah.
Okay, so I assume they had no children, since you didn't mention them.
They did have children. That's this afternoon's program. Is more the Plumb stuff. I tried not to be too Plumb heavy, but they did have children. They had 6 children. One of them died when he was about 2 years old, but 5 of them, you know, survived. They basically left Kansas after a while. His oldest son, Dale, stayed in Kansas. He died in the 1930s. And then his daughter, Roxana, passed away in the 1980s. So there's no direct descendants of him in Kansas anymore. His brother, George, still, you know, stayed in Emporia, and the whole family moved to Emporia when he moved there. And George has descendants that are still in Emporia and in the area.
So, and then how did she have money? How did, you know, after he died and stuff, were they...
As a senator, he had money. He worked for everything he had, you know, running the newspaper, after the war, being one of the most successful law firms in the state of Kansas. That was very lucrative. And then he would take that money and make investments. And as president of the bank, that also was a good salary, but a lot of it came from investments and things. They had investments in real estate, smelters, you know, mines, all sorts of things. Any other questions?
How old was he when he started all of this? When he was became he didn't look very old. I mean,
When he went into the Senate?
Yeah, well, when he was an officer, how old was he?
He was 25 when he joined the Army. Yeah. Yeah, he did a lot. Well, he did almost everything at a very young age. You know, starting his own newspaper at 16, being in the state legislature, you know, in his very early 20s, and then 25 in the Army, and then
Where did he get all his knowledge?
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
he was so...
And that's this afternoon's talk too.
Okay.
But
Good question.
you're stealing my thunder. No, no, it's all right. He had what we would call a photographic memory. And not only that, he had, you know, let's say someone seems like they have a 1-track mind. He had a 2, 3, 4-track mind. There's multiple accounts of him at his Senate office where, say, you come in to talk to me and I'm having a conversation with you. Well, I'm also dictating 2 letters to 2 different stenographers and reading the newspaper at the same time and bouncing between all of them. And it's funny because a lot of people, when they first met him, obviously would not think he was like that, did not know that. And so people would watch him in the Senate, and he would be giving this impassioned Senate speech and then reading papers. And people in the Senate gallery would say, oh, look at this guy Plumb, you know, he needs his notes, he doesn't know what he's doing. And then people who knew him would say, no, he's reading his mail. So he would be giving this impassioned Senate speech and then reading his mail at the same time. There's another story where he took a trip to Monticello with another senator who was a friend of his, and he was having a conversation with him and then reading a book at the same time. And finally the other senator said, either you're not listening to me or you're not understanding what's in the book. You can't be doing both. And so Plumb closed the book and then handed it to him, and he said, give me a page number. And so the senator says 87, and Plumb just starts telling him what was on page 87. And so because of that, he was an incredibly successful and prolific senator. Kansas was never more powerful in the Senate than it was when it had Plumb and Ingalls in the Senate. Ingalls was a very, very skilled orator. Plumb was not so much. He was the everyman, but because of his incredible command of facts, figures, laws, things like that, and whenever a debate came up, he could quote other senators to death, you know, kind of, and it was brutal.
He'd been a good lawyer to have.
He was, yeah, and that's why his law firm was so successful. I mean, he was incredibly successful, and you know, because he had this tremendous work ethic, you know, he did everything himself. A lot of senators had staffers that would go to the outer departments, take care of issues at the Treasury Department or other things. He took care of everything himself. Everyone that sent him a letter got a response. At the time of his death, he was getting about 300 letters a day.
No wonder he didn't sleep.
Yeah. And you know, he introduced a lot of legislation that still affects us all today. He's the one that made the Department of Agriculture its own federal department. Prior to him, it was not a cabinet position. So for any state that is agriculturally based, this is huge, because as a cabinet position, now you have a Department of Agriculture. The head of that department is now regularly in cabinet meetings with the president, can now regularly attend Senate meetings, and can speak in the Senate. That was huge. He did that. He pushed through the legislation that created Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. In Wyoming, he created our Shoshone National Forest, which is a huge site for us. He introduced a lot of legislation that was way ahead of its time. He tried to push through a national currency. Well, what do we have today? A national currency. It was rejected at the time. The Senate didn't go for it, but he tried to push that through. He introduced the first set of regulations for forestry and land conservation, the basis of which became what we know as the U.S. Forest Service. He created those laws because there was no regulation for any of that. He also created the first set of laws dealing with the cattle industry as far as regulating cattle that had diseases or were sick, so that when they were being shipped to Kansas City or wherever, Chicago, for processing, that kind of thing, they would not contaminate other cattle, or that these diseases could then be eradicated by a coordinated effort amongst various states. So for instance, if a disease breaks out in Kansas and cattle from Kansas are now going to Chicago, to the stockyards, they're now infecting herds in different ways. So now it's a multi-state effort to stop those infections. And so he introduced all of the legislation that started that, which is something that still exists today. So yeah, very, very, very prolific senator that kind of just fell through the cracks. But this part was, I tried to just focus on his military career, and then this afternoon we'll talk a little more about, you know, his Senate accomplishments and those kinds of things, and how he affected Kansas overall. But I could ramble about him for hours.
Thank you.
Thank you.